Hi folks, my name is Dave and welcome to my fourth video in a series on Jordan and Israel. Today we're going to focus mostly on the Golan Heights, and we're going to start off at Tel Dan, which is the beginning of the Jordan River, but oh so much more. And then we're going to go up to Caesarea Philippi, and there are incredible stories we'll learn about there. After that, we're going to go up to the top of the Golan Heights to Mount Bental, and we're going to oversee Syria and beautiful views of Mount Hermon as well. And then back down to the Sea of Galilee, where we're going to explore the beautiful Mount Beatitudes. We've been at the remote resort for the past few days with beautiful views off our balcony of the Sea of Galilee. As we pack up and pull out of our hotel, it's not long before we're actually on the Golan Heights as we head to our first destination, the Tel Dan Nature Reserve. The Golan Heights is actually a pretty large area containing over 700 square miles, and we'll be on top of the Golan Heights later this afternoon at an old Syrian bunker lookout. But in the meantime, check out the drive. I'd have to say that this day on our tour was the most beautiful, scenic, preconception of Israel busting day on the tour. If I'd been blindfolded and asked to guess where we were, Israel would have been at the bottom of the list. We're here in late February, the green season, so a lot of what we're seeing today will change dramatically over the next couple of weeks. But wow, it's remarkable. The Golan Heights that we're driving through is a volcanic terrain, and everything we see out our bus windows is actually covered with lava. The Golan Heights is famous for its winemaking, but also famous for its excellent beef cattle from the Bashan grazing area. The cows of Bashan actually get a shout out in the Old Testament. Check it out in Amos chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Now, to give you a little historical perspective of this area, the Golan Heights was part of the biblical Promised Land. I'm going to bypass a couple thousand years to 1946 when the French Mandate ended and the Golan Heights became part of Syria. Syria then teamed up with 6 Arab nations and fought Israel in the War of Independence from 1947 to 1949. Syria lost that fight, but apparently nobody told them, or at least they never acknowledged Israel's right to exist. And for the next 19 years, Syria still occupied these hills, while Israel occupied the valley below. They were sitting ducks as machine gun fire rained down on them from the Syrian bunkers. The Israeli residents in the valley planted fast-growing eucalyptus trees in front of their houses so the Syrian snipers couldn't shoot at them, which proved to be very effective. In fact, you still can't see the houses located behind those trees. However, there were also many times when their homes were destroyed by bombing raids. You can't see it now, but there are still trenches on both sides of this road where Syrian snipers would shoot at Israeli vehicles as they passed by during the War of Independence. Finally, in June of 1967, Israel captured the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War. Israel also captured what's called the shoulder of Mount Hermon at that time. The head of Mount Hermon belongs to Syria. Mount Hermon is a long ridge of mountains, and the watershed line on the top of the mountain is actually the geographical and political boundary between Syria and Lebanon. The Tel Dan Nature Reserve is our first stop of the day, and there's a lot to take in here. At Tel is an archaeological mound of a civilization that is either still buried beneath the ground, has already been, or is currently being excavated. This Tel is the biblical city of Dan, and to get to Tel Dan, we head out for a beautiful hike on this nature trail. There are different levels of trails around this area, and we took the adventurous one, which means you may get your feet wet. But the view of the river we have is spectacular, and realize that Dan is the largest spring in the Middle East, and this is the beginning of the Jordan River. Our guide Iran stopped our hike by this mulberry tree, which was brought over by China in the 16th century for the silk industry. In previous videos, we've talked about the Via Maris and the King's Highway, but there is also a trade route from China to the Mediterranean Sea called the Cross Asia Route, which eventually would be known as the Silk Route. So, what does a mulberry tree have to do with the silk industry? Silkworms only eat leaves from this tree. For the next few seconds, just sit back and take a look at what this nature trail has to offer. Eventually, we come to the very beginning of the Dan, which makes up 50% of the Jordan River. Water from melting snow and rain has been traveling underground until it finally pops up here at the Spring of Dan. It's a great time to sit, relax, and reflect on the living waters that God has provided for us, both figuratively and literally. A little further up the trail, we come to the ancient city of Dan, the city that defines the northern border of Israel. The tribe of Dan conquered this city, which was known as Laisha or Laish, back in the book of Judges. Excavations are still taking place today, and it will be exciting to hear of new discoveries as they take place. Jeroboam, who was the first king of northern Israel, placed golden calves at the city of Dan and Bental to signify the boundaries of his kingdom. Unfortunately for Jeroboam, God doesn't take kindly to golden idols. He was warned several times and eventually suffered huge losses in battles against the southern kingdom. This metal frame is a 3D outline of where the altar of Jeroboam once stood. Just beyond the altar is a platform known as the high place where the golden calf at Dan was on display. Sacrifices were made on the altar to the golden calf located on the high place. You can just imagine the high priest holding up the sacrifice to the golden calf, just like the high priests at Megiddo would hold up their sacrifice toward Mount Carmel, where the house of Baal was located. Archaeologists have also discovered a reservoir from the Hellenistic era, along with several animal bones at this location. Just in back of the high place is the physical line between Israel and Syria. The dirt road in the foreground is an old patrol road, and today it is the international border between Syria and Israel, and there is a 2-mile buffer zone between the road and Syrian civilization. One of the cool things to discover here is the place where God made his covenant with Abraham. It's located right here, where the antenna is located on this peak. Lebanon has about 5 million people, and approximately 25% are Christians. For the past year, there have been around 1 million people demonstrating in the streets against Hezbollah, which acts as a proxy for Iran, and against Syria trying to interfere in Lebanon. With the recent explosion bombing that took place in Beirut, it's obviously a very hot spot in the world today. Zionism, the national Jewish movement, started about 140 years ago in 1882. This is the first time the Jews came back to their land with intentions to build a Jewish homeland. There's a lot of political rhetoric regarding the term Zionism today, but initially, it was a movement to reestablish a Jewish national home after centuries of being involuntarily scattered throughout the world. During World War I, the European powers were trying to determine how to conquer and divide the Middle East between Russia, England, and France. The English needed an excuse to conquer Israel so they could claim the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean. So they promised the Jews ownership of their biblical homeland. This is known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The League of Nations, now called the UN, provided the Jewish people a home in Palestine. The entire world agreed to give Israel ownership of both sides of the Jordan River. In 1921, the British and French established the border right here in Dan because they knew of the biblical reference of Dan belonging to the Jews. However, there's a saying that the map that was created was very small and the pencil was very thick, leaving lots of interpretation as to where the real borderline was located. The Syrians said they owned the headwater of the Jordan River located in Dan, and that started the famous 6-Day War. It was a fight over water rights. The Great Britain government conquered Palestine just before Christmas during the Festival of Lights on October 31st, 1917, and everyone thought the days of the Messiah had finally arrived. It was a great, joyous occasion for the Jews, and the song Hava Nagila was written to celebrate this event. You know that song, right? Well, I don't have Aaron's permission to use his voice for his teachings, but I don't think he'd mind singing this great song for us.
נגילה הווה, נגילה ונשמחה, הווה נרננה, הווה נרננה, הווה הווה נרננה. Let's rejoice together, let's rejoice together, let's rejoice together. Wake up, brothers, מוכרים ושמח, ורוחים בלב שמח, ורוחים בלב שמח, ורוחים בלב שמח, ורוחים בלב שמח, hava, and it's going on and on.
Yeah.
And today you hear it in every American Super Bowl game.
Alas, the Great Britain government neglected all their promises. Well, let's move on to something more uplifting. Before the tribe of Dan conquered this area, the Canaanite city of Laisha was built around 2700 BC, and it included a wall 30 to 50 feet high and 25 feet wide at its base, all around a 50-acre perimeter. That is huge. Now, why would anyone need a 50-foot wall?
Agree to my commands, then I shall...
Now I get it. About the only thing left of this Canaanite wall today is this gate, which was found in 1979 and restored in 2009. It's 23 feet high and made out of brick, and is one of the earliest complete arches found in the world and one of the only ones still standing. The gate is composed of 3 arches, which are the oldest arches ever found in the land of Israel. This gate is also known as Abraham's Gate, since it's most likely that Abraham went through this gate to save his nephew Lot from the story in Genesis chapter 14. Lot had been kidnapped from Sodom, so Abraham took 318 of his trained men and chased the bad guys as far as Dan, where he rescued Lot. Further down the trail, we come to the ancient Israelite town at Tel Dan, which dates back to around 1350 BC. You can see what looks like a marketplace similar to what we saw in Magdala, along with a plaza where the townfolk would hang out and fellowship. Just inside the outer gate is a meeting place where the elders would hear cases and discuss events of the day. Beyond this outer gate, there's an inner gate where ruins of houses have been discovered just up the hill. Folks, you can spend an entire day here. There is so much more to see than what we were able to squeeze in. The Tel Dan Nature Reserve is such a cool place. Unfortunately, we can't stay, but we're headed to an incredible site at Caesarea Philippi, less than 10 minutes away. Caesarea Philippi was known as the center for pagan worship. In the book of Joshua, chapter 11, Joshua mentions Baal Gad, known as the god of fortune, located at the base of Mount Hermon, right in this area. A couple hundred years later, the area would be conquered by the Greeks, who brought Greek mythology and Greek gods into this area. And a couple hundred years after that, the Romans would conquer this area, and they adopted the Greek mythology and their gods, but just renamed them into Roman names. Look at how beautiful this area is. It really is impressive. Like the Dan we just visited, this is one of the headwaters of the Jordan River. 25% of the Jordan River water comes from right here. The first person to ever build a city here was Herod's son Philippus, which is where the name Caesarea Philippi is derived from. The city is yet to be excavated, and only the temple area has been uncovered, so 99% of the city is still buried beneath the ground. Caesarea Philippi is also known as Banias, which is named after the Greek god Pan. Panias was the original name of the place where Pan was worshipped. However, the Arabic language has a hard time pronouncing the P sound, and they called it Banias, and it stuck to this day. The cave is the heart of this whole area. Originally, there was a natural mouth that formed in front of this cave where the water would pour out. It was super impressive. Somewhere around 1,000 years ago, the roof of the cave collapsed, breaking the mouth of the cave and plugging up the existing waterway. Today, the springs burst forth just below the cave. As we head up to the temple site, there's a covered area that houses ceiling decorations that were part of the temple. These were made from molded plaster and once were very colorful, but have faded to white over time. We know from our previous stops that bright colors were used during this era. For a reference of what we're about to see, here's a drawing of what was back around 200 AD. I'll go into a little more detail on each of these sites as we move along. From left to right, we start off with the Temple of Augustus, and just in back of the temple is the cave known as the Grotto of the god Pan. Pan is depicted as a man with horns, a thick beard, pointy ears, and legs and tail of a goat. Sounds exactly as we envision Satan today, doesn't it? And indeed, he was. Next to that is the court of Pan and the nymphs. Now, Pan was known as the god of the shepherds and hunters, but also as the god of fertility. Nymphs were usually thought of as young female inferior goddesses of the forest and rivers, and there are many stories about Pan chasing nymphs in the forest. I'll just leave it right there. Next is the Temple of Zeus, and right next door is the court of the goddess of Nemesis. Can you imagine trying to make her happy? Yikes! The last site on this upper section is the tomb temple of the sacred goats, with the Temple of Pan and the dancing goats just below that. Only the Temple of Augustus, named after Caesar, and the Grotto of Pan existed during Jesus' time on earth, but their reputation was widespread. We actually walked up a trail from the right-hand side, so we'll revisit each of these areas in reverse order. Now, some think the purpose of the dancing goats was to bring in a crowd. You know, come to Caesarea Philippi and see the dancing goats. The dancing goat stage was built around 220 AD, and only part of the semicircle theater has survived. The tomb of the sacred goats was also built around 220 AD. You can see some of the structure that still exists from this view below. The bones of the goats that took part in the rituals of Pan were buried here, and the rituals were conducted on the roof in front of the rock-carved niche. Right next door is the court of Nemesis. Now, she was the goddess of vengeance and Roman imperial justice. This court was built around 178 AD, and her statue would have been placed inside the large niche. Now, I have to admit, I really like her choice of pavers. The Temple of Zeus is next door to Nemesis. Zeus's temple was built around 98 AD for the city's 100th anniversary. One of the four capitals of the temple survived and stands on its southeast corner, but other than that, only pieces of its foundation have survived. But this was a grand temple with 4 columns and a portico out front. The Temple of Pan and the Nymphs was built around 50 AD. There's a huge niche where a large statue of Pan would have been located, and there are several smaller niches carved above Pan's niche where statues of nymphs would have been on display. Pagan cult worship started here around the 3rd century BC at the Grotto of Pan. Josephus wrote about this cave and stated that there was a shaft inside the cave that was so deep no one had a long enough piece of rope to see how deep it was. It was well understood that this was the gate to the underworld, literally the gates of hell in their minds. Goats and children were sacrificed here, and as I mentioned, the modern depiction of Satan is just a reflection of the god Pan. The Temple of Augustus was built with white marble around 10 BC by King Herod, who willed this region to his younger son Philippus when he died in 4 BC. Philippus then built this city up to be his capital and to honor his Caesar, Tiberius. Why would Jesus bring his disciples here? This area was forbidden to all Jews, and the disciples would never think of setting foot here because of all the idol worship and debauchery that took place in plain view of the public. But Jesus brought them here to demonstrate the stark difference between all of these false gods and who He is. This is the place where Jesus asked His disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" This is found in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, and they replied, "Elijah, John the Baptist, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." And then He asked, "But who do you say that I am?" And this is when Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the anointed Messiah, the Son of the living God." He was asking His disciples, "Am I one of these false gods you see before you? Or am I the real thing?" Jesus said that He would build His church upon this rock, referring to Himself, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. That cave was considered the gates of hell. Jesus literally brought His disciples to the gates of hell as they understood it. Jesus was also challenging the Jewish thinking that they should flee from areas like this. He was saying His church needs to be involved in all areas of society, seeking out the lost in every corner. We are to be in the world, but not of the world. Don't run from evil, but take it on. From here, Jesus would soon experience His transfiguration on a mountain, which some believe is Mount Hermon in the back of Caesarea Philippi, or more probable is Mount Tabor. This is the turning point for Jesus' ministry as He starts His journey towards Jerusalem. Well, all that hiking around makes me hungry, and we found an awesome Lebanese restaurant within walking distance, with a river flowing beside it and through it. Even better, the falafel sandwich and chicken shawarma were awesome. Our third stop of the day is Mount Bental on the Golan Heights. With traffic, it'll take us about an hour, and on a day like this, it's a beautiful drive. People are out hiking, driving, just enjoying the day. This is the road to Damascus, or at least one of them. Damascus is just 50 miles ahead, but since it's in Syria, we're going to play it safe and just take a peek over the border. One of the unusual things about the Golan Heights is that there are a handful of Druze towns like this one out our bus window. No, not Druids, but Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. Druze are a religious sect that are primarily located in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. They are known to form close-knit communities that do not fully allow non-Druze in, although they do fully integrate with their adopted homelands. There's around 30,000 Druze in this town and approximately 150,000 Druze living in Israel today. Druze do not accept converts into their faith, and marriage outside their faith is highly discouraged. As we head up to the top of our destination, we are greeted by these art sculptures made from old weapons found in the area. Kind of reminds you of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 2, who prophesies that their weapons will be turned into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. The views up here are incredible, and you can easily see why this would be a highly prized strategic military location. In fact, this area is rich in military battle history. Now, we've talked about the Balfour Act of 1941. Let's skip ahead a couple years after World War II, when Palestine was a hot potato thrown onto the laps of the UN. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors were spread all over Europe, but the British would not allow them back into Israel. On November 29, 1947, the UN decided to partition out the land of Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. Even though the plan destroyed the Balfour Agreement of 1941 by giving Jordan the east side of the Jordan River and giving the Arabs all of the high ground in Galilee and giving just the lowland and the desert in the south to the Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no. The next day, the War of Independence started. The Civil War lasted for 5.5 months until the British left in May of 1948 and Israel declared independence. However, on that very same day, Israel was invaded by 6 Arabic nations. Israel prevailed in those attacks, and after the war, 700,000 Arabs went from the Jewish state to the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, or Jordan. This is the beginning of the Palestinian refugees issue. At the same time, the Jews received 850 Jewish refugees from Arab territories. That's a swap of over 1.5 million people. We've also talked about the Six-Day War in 1967. In those 6 days, the Israeli army destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in 12 minutes, and in 5 hours destroyed the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian air forces and gained air superiority. This allowed Israel to conquer the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. These are known as the territories. Israel was told they could keep those territories for future peace negotiations. Israel wouldn't negotiate with Syria for the Golan Heights, and that brings us to October 6, 1973, when 4 Syrian MiG fighters were spotted by a reporter on the Golan Heights. The Syrians had been humiliated during the Six-Day War, and they had been plotting their revenge with Russian support for several years. The entire Syrian army had been mobilized, and they were marching in this valley below to conquer Galilee. The Israeli army that had been left here knew that there was nothing between the Syrian army and Israeli cities except for them, and another Holocaust was in play. The Jews will tell you that God works in mysterious ways because in a miraculous act of forgetfulness, the Syrian army forgot to bring their portable bridges with them to cross the anti-tank canals, and when the Syrian tanks began to fall into those canals, the Israeli tanks were able to pick them off easily. The Syrian commanders ordered their troops to fill the anti-tank canals with dirt and dead bodies, which the tanks climbed over to keep marching forward. After 3 days, Israeli reinforcements arrived and were able to stop them. Today, this valley is known as the Valley of Tears of the Syrian army, as it was littered with hundreds of burned Syrian tanks. There's actually Israeli farmland down below. This farmland acts as a buffer zone between the 2 ceasefire lines. Where the farmland ends is where Syria starts. For the past 8 or 9 years, there have been over 1 million citizens that have been killed in Syria, far, far more than all the Israeli wars combined. It has been a devastating civil war. Now, I've covered about 1% of the history that has taken place right here. It is a fascinating area filled with incredible stories and well worth any time you spend researching the Golan Heights. If history isn't your thing, the views up here will justify the trip up the mountain. There is a clear 360-degree view in all directions. We are back on the road again, heading to our final destination of the day, the Mount of Beatitudes, and we're actually heading back to the Sea of Galilee. Well, it's another beautiful drive as the late afternoon relaxing sun comes through the bus window. What? The current church that sits on this site is a Roman Catholic Franciscan chapel designed by Italian architect Antonio Barluzzi and completed in 1938. We don't know that Jesus stood right here, but we do know that he was in this area when he shared the most significant sermon of all time. This site has been commemorated for that event for more than 1,600 years. Even if you haven't been to church much, you've probably heard of the Sermon on the Mount given by Jesus. If you want to look it up, it's in Matthew chapter 5. However, let's have Ray take us through it. It's only 2.5 minutes. You'll be okay.
He's going to tell us not going to read it, but he's going to tell us to be light and salt. And I think as I read this again today, that the way we become light and salt is, as this is called, the Mount of Beatitudes. It's living what Jesus is just preaching. And it's pretty straightforward here. One day as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the hillside, up on the mountainside, and sat down. His disciples gathered around him and he began to teach them. Here's what he said. He said, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him. Realize their need for him. How many think if you want to be light and salt, you have to recognize your need of a Savior? Of someone who can lead your life. And then he said, realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In him. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. And then he said something crazy. He said, be happy. Be glad about it. For a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. And then he gets to the crux here of what he's just said, in my opinion. That these things all have value to do one thing. He said, you are the salt of the earth, but what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand, where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. See, the way we live isn't really to bring us glory or to impress anyone. It's just to point people to Jesus.
Thanks, Pastor Ray. I should also let you know to always dress appropriately for the sites you plan on visiting. Because we had a beautiful sunny day, I wore shorts, and guess who was not allowed to enter the church? Just saying. If this view looks a little bit familiar to you, we are right in between Capernaum and the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, where we were at a couple days ago. But we're just in back on a hill about 200 meters higher than the Sea of Galilee. Again, the scenery here is stunning. I would never have thought that Israel was this beautiful. This is one of the most serene places in all of the Holy Land. Well, that's it for this video, folks, but I'll leave you with a couple shots off our balcony overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Next time we meet, we're going to be leaving northern Israel, and we're going to be heading south to the Dead Sea. And man, what a transformation takes place as we leave behind all this greenery that we've been surrounded with, and we head to the desert. And I can't wait to share it with you. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up down below and subscribe to my channel. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Britain government conquered Palestine just before Christmas during the Festival of Lights. I can't say it. Before the tribe of Dan.